The workers stopped digging the moment the shovel hit wood. It was March 1847, and the renovation crew at the Delqua estate in New Orleans had already found 3 identical boxes buried beneath the old slave quarters. Each one contained the same thing. Dozens of small cloth bundles carefully wrapped and preserved, each holding a single human tooth. By the time authorities were called, 17 more boxes had been unearthed from the same area, all following the same pattern. The plantation owner's family claimed complete ignorance, but city records showed something disturbing. Between 1791 and 1823, over 40 enslaved people had vanished from that property without any documentation of sale, death, or transfer. The boxes were quietly removed, the discovery hushed by prominent families with ties to the estate, and for decades, no official explanation was ever provided. What the workers found in those final boxes would reveal a practice so calculated, so methodical that it challenged everything historians thought they understood about power and control in antebellum Louisiana. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and unspeakable truth, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our community of mystery seekers is located. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those slave quarters and why the truth was buried for so long. The discovery at the Delqua estate didn't happen in isolation. It emerged from a city already thick with secrets where the old French and Spanish colonial powers had left layers of tradition, cruelty, and silence that the newer American administration struggled to penetrate. New Orleans in 1847 was a city of contradictions. A place where 3 cultures, French, Spanish, and American, collided and merged into something entirely unique. The air hung heavy with humidity even in March, and the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the less pleasant odor of the docks, where ships from across the world unloaded cargo, both inanimate and human. The Mississippi River, swollen with spring rains, flowed past the city like a brown serpent, carrying with it the commerce and secrets of half a continent. The city had been American territory for over 4 decades. Purchased from Napoleon in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase, but its soul remained distinctly Creole. French was still spoken as commonly as English in the markets and drawing rooms. Spanish architectural influences dominated the older quarters with their wrought iron balconies and hidden courtyards. And beneath it all, the rhythms and traditions of Africa and the Caribbean pulsed through the city's veins, brought by enslaved people who'd been torn from their homelands and forced to build a new world for their masters. The Delqua estate sat on the northern edge of what locals were beginning to call the Garden District. Though in 1847 that area was still being developed by wealthy Americans who'd made their fortunes in cotton, sugar, and the slave trade itself. The main house was a sprawling structure of white columns and wide galleries built in 1789 by Jean-Baptiste Delqua, a French merchant who'd fled Saint-Domingue during the early tremors of what would become the Haitian Revolution. Jean-Baptiste had been a shrewd man, according to the records that survived him. He'd seen the writing on the wall in Saint-Domingue earlier than most of his fellow colonists, and he'd managed to escape with a substantial portion of his wealth intact, along with 12 enslaved people who'd been forced to accompany him into exile. In New Orleans, he'd used that wealth to purchase land and establish himself as a sugar planter, though his operation was smaller than the massive plantations that dominated the areas south of the city. The slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins behind the main house, had housed anywhere from 30 to 60 enslaved people over the decades, depending on the family's fortunes and the demands of the sugar harvest. The cabins were simple structures, each about 12 feet square, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked during the frequent rainstorms. In winter, cold air seeped through the gaps between the boards. In summer, the interiors became ovens, trapping heat and humidity until breathing itself became an effort. By 1847, the estate had passed to Jean-Baptiste's grandson, Christophe Delqua, a man in his early 50s who'd inherited not just property, but a reputation. Christophe was known throughout New Orleans society as a man of culture and refinement. He spoke fluent French, Spanish, and English. He traveled to Paris twice and maintained correspondence with intellectuals in France. He collected books, patronized local artists, and hosted salons where the city's elite gathered to discuss literature, philosophy, and politics. His wife, Margot, was the daughter of a prominent Creole family, the Beaumonts, who could trace their lineage back to the earliest French settlers of Louisiana. She was known for her elaborate soirees, events that could last until dawn and featured the finest food, wine, and entertainment that New Orleans had to offer. Their 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, attended the finest schools and were being groomed to take their places among the city's aristocracy. To the outside world, the Delqua family represented the best of New Orleans society, cultured, prosperous, and respectable. But those who worked closely with the family, the house servants who saw them in their private moments, the vendors who delivered goods to the estate, the neighbors whose properties adjoined theirs, spoke in whispers of something else. The Delqua estate had an unusually high turnover of enslaved workers. People would arrive, purchased at the slave markets on Chartres Street, or brought in from other plantations, work for a period of months or sometimes years, and then simply disappear from the property. When questioned, the family would provide vague explanations. Sold to a plantation upriver, sent to work in the household of a relative in Mobile, died of fever, and buried in the pauper's field outside the city. These explanations were accepted because they were common. Enslaved people were property and property changed hands frequently. Disease was rampant in New Orleans, particularly during the summer months when yellow fever swept through the city with devastating regularity. Death was so common that it barely warranted comment. But there were inconsistencies that troubled those who paid attention. Bills of sale that should have existed for transferred enslaved people couldn't be found. Death certificates that should have been filed with the city were missing. And sometimes people who'd supposedly been sold to plantations upriver would be spotted months later in New Orleans working for different masters with no memory of ever leaving the city or with memories so fragmented and confused that they couldn't provide a coherent account of what had happened to them. One person who'd noticed these inconsistencies was Father Antoine Blanc, a Catholic priest who served the French-speaking community in New Orleans. Father Blanc had been hearing confessions and providing spiritual guidance to both free and enslaved people for over 20 years, and he developed a reputation as a man who genuinely cared about the souls in his care, regardless of their social status. In the spring of 1846, a year before the boxes would be discovered, Father Blanc had been approached by an elderly enslaved woman named Josephine, who worked in the Delqua household. Josephine had been with the family for over 30 years, having been purchased by Jean-Baptiste himself in the 1810s. She was one of the few enslaved people who'd remained on the property for an extended period, and she'd seen dozens of others come and go. Josephine told Father Blanc a disturbing story. She claimed that Jean-Baptiste Delqua had practiced a form of control over the enslaved people on his property that went beyond the usual brutalities of slavery. He'd extracted teeth from newly arrived enslaved people, telling them that as long as he held their teeth, they could never truly be free. The teeth, he'd claimed, contained their souls, their essence, and he would use them to track down anyone who tried to escape or to curse anyone who disobeyed him. Josephine herself had lost a tooth to Jean-Baptiste's practice when she'd first arrived at the estate. She remembered the terror of that day, the way Jean-Baptiste had explained the ritual in his precise French, translated by an older enslaved man who'd been on the property for years. She remembered the pain of the extraction, performed without any form of anesthetic, and the way Jean-Baptiste had wrapped the tooth in cloth and placed it in a wooden box with dozens of others. For years, Josephine had believed absolutely in the power of the ritual. She'd seen what happened to people who tried to escape. They were always caught, always returned, and she believed it was because Jean-Baptiste had used their teeth to track them down. She'd seen people who disobeyed suffer mysterious illnesses or accidents, and she'd believed it was because Jean-Baptiste had cursed them through their teeth. But as she'd grown older, as she'd seen Jean-Baptiste die and his son take over the estate, as she'd watched the practice gradually fade away, Josephine had begun to question. Had the teeth really held power, or had it all been an elaborate trick, a way of exploiting the spiritual beliefs that many enslaved people had brought with them from Africa and the Caribbean? Father Blanc had listened to Josephine's story with growing horror. He'd heard rumors of similar practices on other plantations, whispers of psychological control that went beyond physical punishment, but he'd never encountered such a detailed account, and he'd never heard of anyone documenting the practice so systematically. He'd asked Josephine if she knew what had happened to the boxes of teeth after Jean-Baptiste's death. She told him that Jean-Baptiste's son, Christophe's father, whose name had also been Christophe, had been disturbed by the discovery of the boxes, and had ordered them buried somewhere on the property. She didn't know exactly where, but she'd heard the house servants talking about a burial that had taken place late one night in 1824, shortly after the elder Christoph had found his father's journal describing the tooth extraction practice. Father Blanc had wanted to investigate further, but Josephine had begged him not to. She was terrified of what might happen if the Delqua family discovered that she'd spoken to him. Despite her doubts about the power of the teeth, decades of conditioning had left her deeply afraid of the family's retribution. Father Blanc had reluctantly agreed to keep her confidence, but he'd made notes about their conversation in his personal journal. Those notes would later prove crucial to understanding the full scope of what had happened at the Delqua estate. The renovation in March 1847 was meant to modernize the slave quarters and expand the estate's capacity. Christoph Delqua had recently purchased 15 additional enslaved people at auction, and he needed more housing for them. He'd hired a crew of Irish immigrants, men who'd fled the Great Famine and were willing to work for low wages to tear down 2 of the older cabins and build new structures with brick foundations instead of the rotting wooden posts that had supported the original buildings. The foreman of the crew was a man named Patrick Brennan, a 35-year-old from County Cork, who'd arrived in New Orleans just 6 months earlier with his wife and 3 children. Brennan had been a tenant farmer in Ireland, and he'd watched his neighbors starve as the potato blight destroyed crop after crop. He'd sold everything he owned to pay for passage to America, believing the promises of opportunity and prosperity that immigration agents had spread throughout Ireland. The reality of life in New Orleans had been harsher than Brennan had expected. The Irish immigrants were relegated to the most dangerous and degrading work, digging canals through swamps filled with disease-carrying mosquitoes, loading and unloading cargo on the docks, and taking on construction jobs that even enslaved people weren't forced to do because the risk of death or injury was too high. If an enslaved person died, the master lost valuable property. If an Irish immigrant died, he could simply be replaced by another desperate arrival from the next ship. But Brennan was a survivor. He'd learned quickly, worked hard, and managed to establish himself as a reliable foreman. The job at the Delqua estate was a good one by his standards. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward, and Christoph Delqua had a reputation for treating his workers fairly, at least by the standards of the time. Brennan had assembled a crew of 6 men, all Irish immigrants like himself, all desperate for work. Among them was a young man named Seamus Corrigan, barely 20 years old, who'd lost his entire family to the famine and had arrived in New Orleans alone and penniless. There was also Michael O'Brien, a former stonemason who'd worked on churches and manor houses in Ireland before the famine had destroyed his livelihood. And there was Thomas Murphy, a quiet man in his 40s, who rarely spoke about his past, but who worked with a grim determination that suggested he was trying to outrun painful memories. The crew had started work on a Monday morning in early March. The weather was mild with a light breeze coming off the river, and the work had progressed smoothly for the first few days. They'd torn down the first cabin without incident, hauling away the rotted wood and clearing the site for the new foundation. It was on Thursday, March 11th, that they'd begun digging the foundation trench for the first new building. The soil was soft and easy to work, a mixture of clay and sand that was typical of the area. They'd been digging for about an hour, reaching a depth of roughly 3 feet, when Seamus Corrigan's shovel struck something solid. "Stone," Corrigan had muttered, expecting to find a rock or perhaps an old tree root. But when he'd cleared away the soil, he'd found instead a wooden box roughly 2 feet long and a foot wide with a flat lid secured by rusted nails. Brennan had come over to investigate and the other workers had gathered around curious about what they'd found. Brennan later testified that his first thought was treasure, perhaps coins or jewelry hidden by someone decades earlier. New Orleans was full of stories about buried treasure, about pirates and smugglers who'd hidden their loot in the swamps and forests around the city. Finding a buried box seemed like the kind of lucky break that could change a man's life. He'd pried open the lid with a crowbar, and the men had gathered around to see what was inside. The box contained no treasure. Instead, it held dozens of small cloth bundles, each one tied with twine that had darkened with age. The bundles were arranged in neat rows packed tightly together. Brennan had opened one of the bundles carefully, his hands shaking slightly with a mixture of excitement and dread. Inside the cloth was a single human tooth, yellowed with age, but otherwise intact. The other workers had stepped back, crossing themselves. Finding a buried box was one thing. Finding a box full of human teeth was something else entirely. Within the next hour, they found 2 more boxes, identical to the first, buried at roughly the same depth and spaced about 10 feet apart. Each box contained the same thing: dozens of cloth-wrapped teeth. By this point, Brennan knew he couldn't keep the discovery quiet. He sent one of the younger workers, Seamus, to fetch the estate manager. What happened next would plunge the Delqua estate into a scandal that would ripple through New Orleans society and force the city to confront a horror it had long preferred to ignore.